Welcome to chapter 10 of Tsotsi. I'll just jump right in. Tsotsi opened his eyes and listened to the knocking on his door. Instinctively, but for no other reason than having awoken, he put his hand under his pillow to find his knife. Before he found it, another thought crossed his mind, and he sat up on his elbows and looked down to the foot of the bed. The baby was still there and apparently asleep. So you'll remember in chapter 9, Miriam and Gidi came and fed the baby again. The knocking had stopped, but now came again. Tsotsi shook his head. He must have fallen asleep. Sometime in the night, his tiredness must have caught up with him, and he'd fallen asleep. The knocking started again. Who was that? Suddenly he thought about the woman, that's Miriam and Gidi, the one he got to feed the baby. Why her? Why would she come back? Tsotsi shook his head again. Things were happening and thoughts were coming too fast for him. He felt for his knife, but it did exactly the opposite of what it was meant to do. Instead of pacifying him or making him calm, it started a separate new sequence of thoughts. He remembered the river again, the river where he was living in those pipes when he'd run away from the father after the father kicked the dog, the gangs, then his mother, then Peter, one of these other kids. The person outside knocked again. But it's not the woman. He thinks it's the woman, but when he says, "Who's there?" he hears Diab answering. "Tsotsi, is that you?" Tsotsi stopped and listened. "This is me." Diab added, "Jesus." The Diab says, "This is me." "Jeez, what now? What the hell now? Things were happening too fast. What do you want?" No answer. "Diab, it's me, Diab man, hey?" Tsotsi gently hid the baby under the bed before opening the door. Diab smiled. "Where's his front teeth?" Tsotsi thought, and then, why the hell am I thinking that? I did think he wasn't here. Diab was saying, "What's the time? Morning, can't you see?" "What do you want?" "Yes, it's morning." "What do you want?" "I just come, man." "For what?" "Hell, don't I just always come? Where else do I go, hell? Hey? Nowhere, man. I just come here." "Well, don't." Tsotsi closed the door in his face and went to his bed and sat down. A few seconds later, Diab's head appeared at the window. "Why?" he asked. Tsotsi says, "Yes, why?" And Tsotsi's thinking, my mother, my father, the bitch, the river, a spider spinning a web, but most of all my mother. He had to return to that thought. Everything started there. My mother. The words were strong and full of meaning, and a clear thought formed in his mind. Had he looked, he would have seen Diab's eyes widen at the window. There was a thought, if ever there was one. Tsotsi's mother. "Your mother? Mine is dead." "Not you knew her." "Not yours, mine. She died." Tsotsi looked at Diab. It was strange. He'd never realized it before. Every man had a mother. Every single person in the world had a mother. I'm reminded of Morris Chabalala telling Tsotsi that mothers love their children. Boston too. Geez, what about Boston? He would get around to that, and he does by the end of the chapter. And Diab and Butcher, what about them? "Where's Butcher?" "Gone, he won't come." Diab was resting his chin on the windowsill. His head bobbed as he spoke. "But I did." Tsotsi considered this. Butcher gone. Boston gone. The gang finished. Just like that, finished. Himself thinking it just like that. One word, finished. What now? Another gang? Could there be another one? Why not? Since the river. But what about before the river? He was fed up about Saturday. He said, "You done a job alone." Saturday night and the cripple, Morris Chabalala. "We come here on Sunday morning, but you wasn't here." Sunday morning and the ants. "We come back in the afternoon, but we heard a woman here." The woman who'd fed the baby, Miriam and Gidi. "Yeah, maybe you did," Tsotsi said suddenly. "Maybe there was a woman here. Maybe I done a job alone. So what?" "That's what I tell him, Tsotsi. All along I've been saying maybe. And when he says this morning to let us go up and join with Buster and his boys, I says maybe. But he finds a bloody long word, man, and goes." "So what are you doing here?" "I come here." "Why don't you go with him?" 2 years, Tsotsi." What's 2 years? We've been together. He blinked at the Arp. He blinked a few times as if that would clear his vision of habit, of the muzziness that came from seeing the same thing so much until you saw it no more. 2 years, and he's got no front teeth, and 2 years, strong, the strongest. 2 years he stayed and followed me like a dog follows a man. So we start again, Tsotsi, hey man. It was like this then. So now we find a couple of others and we start again, and the baby started crying, the baby that Tsotsi's hidden away. For a moment the Arp was fooled, and he looked back over his shoulder. Then he realized that the sound was coming from the room, from under the bed on which Tsotsi was sitting. He opened his mouth to say something, and then realized that Tsotsi hadn't moved when it started, hadn't even registered that he'd heard the sound. Just sitting there watching him, the Arp closed his mouth and pretended he hadn't heard a thing. It cried for a few minutes. The Arp tried to whistle again, looked up at the ceiling, then all the walls, then the floor I left out. Then all the walls. Tsotsi was thinking, start again since the river, but what about before the river? The baby stopped suddenly and Tsotsi says, no, Arp, you're wrong, we don't start again. No, it's finished. Finished, man. Like breakfast, or yesterday, or Boston. Finished cold. The Arp says, so what do I do? Go. Where? I don't care. Okay. He waited a few minutes longer, and in that time they stared at each other. Once more the Arp tried to whistle, but failed. Then he left, neither having said another word. Tsotsi went to the window and watched him walk down the street. He looks drunk, he thought. He walks drunk. What do I care? It said finished. What did that mean? The baby cried again. Tsotsi went back and brought it out from under the bed. For the first time since the night in the grove of blue gum trees, when fate forced it into his hands, he was glad he had it. He rejoiced in the very thing that had disgusted and angered him in the past, like its smell, its wizened or shriveled up ugliness, its crying the raucous yell of noise that came unendingly out of its black hole of a mouth. Everything about it that touched, or could be touched by one of his senses, gave him satisfaction. This was reality, to be heard, to be felt, to be smelt. This was no phantom from his past that came like a dream remembered after many years, and yet seemed real. He could hold this baby in his hands. It was real now, and it was the beginning of 3 strange days, and it was still with him, and crying and wanting milk and things. Its function that moment went beyond giving him a hold on an actual moment of the living, urgent present. He had come the repository of Tsotsi's past, the thing that holds Tsotsi's past. The baby and David himself, that is, at first confused, had now merged into one and the same person. The police raid, the river and Peter, the spider spinning its web, the grey day and the smell of damp newspapers were a future awaiting the baby. He thought of death. What if it died? Then he, Tsotsi, would have to take the past back, and what could he do with it? What could he, in his life in that room, do with the day a long, long time ago, and a woman humming, his mother, and a little boy happy with cotton reels on the floor? Stay alive, he said aloud. Stay alive, David. He's named the child. I'll get you mother's milk. So he's looking for Miriam and Gidi again. When sometime later Miriam and Gidi took her place in the water queue, in case you couldn't see that, when she took her place in the water queue, Tsotsi was waiting at his window, standing so that he could watch her without being seen. He noticed that she looked back at his room many times, so she hasn't forgotten him, and she seems no longer scared, but perhaps wanting to help. And he wondered if it meant that it was going to be easier to get her. He decided that it did, because there wasn't much fear in the way she moved, or in her face when she looked back. It was a furtive, quick turn of the head, furtive as though she doesn't want people to see, when she bent to pick up her bucket and move a few steps forward. After each look she lapsed into an absent mood and seemed to think deep and not to notice anything around her. Then it was her turn at the tap, and when her bucket was full, she started on the way back. Tsotsi had also had time to notice many other things that he'd missed the previous day, like the strong slant to her eyes and the ochre tint of her skin, which was not black like most of the others. Ochre meaning the color of the earth. She stood straight, and although not very tall, she looked it because of the way she carried her body, walking well with the full roll of her hips. One baby had not marked her, or if anything only turned a girl into a woman. The moment of ripening, they said in the township. You only speak of a tree after picking the first fruit. When she was still a distance away, he left the window and went to the door, opening and stepping outside, and then just standing there where she could see him. She came a few more steps and pretended to be tired, putting down her bucket. She wasted a few more seconds by fiddling with the blanket that held the baby to her back, bending forward from the waist while doing so. It was in this position, with a safety pin between her white teeth, that she looked up suddenly and Tsotsi caught her eye. So somehow, just through body language and looking at her, she understands that his baby was waiting in the room again and that he was asking her to come and feed the baby. When she'd come to within a few steps of him, he turned and went into the room. He wasn't sure she'd followed until the room darkened, and then he knew that she was in the doorway. Even so, he did not look back, but went straight to the bed. He's been crying, he said. He looks bad. I got nothing for him. You'll feed him again. Silhouetted in the door with the light behind her, he could see nothing of her face. He didn't need to. The hesitation was obvious, and he was about to say something else, something maybe about her baby, that would make her decide when she finally came in and closed the door. After the glare, it took him a few seconds to accustom his eyes to the dark. When he could see her clearly, she was already at the bed, loosening the blanket that held her child. He knew then that she had wanted to come, that she had come prepared to come, that for all he knew she might even have knocked on his door in passing if he had not stepped out into the street. He knew that firstly because of the ointment she smeared around the sore lips the last time she saw the red marks around the lips where the ants had been. Dipping her finger into a small jar that had come out of a pocket in her dress. There were also the clean clothes come out of the blanket to clothe it, and the powder she dusted all over the small baby. In all this, the ointment, the washing, and the clothing, her own baby cried once, but she silenced it with soft words, bending low so that it could smell her presence. She unbuttons her blouse and begins breastfeeding the child again. Little one, what's the matter? You must drink. Just look, what's your name? Drink, my baby. What do we call you? Peter, the big fisherman. Drink Peter Key, meaning little Peter. Tsotsi says his name is David. She says, are you his father? And Tsotsi thinks of his own father, so big and with feathers, and you'll recall he also thought of his father as always smiling and laughing. David never saw his father, he said. Miriam clicked out her sympathy. Anyway, she knew his real name now and could speak to him. Tsotsi listened. They weren't words, just sounds, soft woman sounds that took him back again. His mother. What the hell does a man do with a mother? Was it really so? Had it really been him? Give him to me. The baby was drinking deeply. Okay, this is the Miriam talking, and she's not saying pass him to me. She's saying give the baby to me that I can look after him. He caught his breath and waited. Give him to me. He's sick. Give him to me and I'll take him and look after him. He thought of his knife first. I will kill her here in this room. She and her child. I'll skip that F word there. I'll kill them dead. I can feed it. She's saying, I have good milk. I know about babies. Then he thought about the baby. I gave him milk. Me on a Saturday in a shop. I bought it. I killed the ants. The woman spoke on. You can see him. You can come to our room and see him. And he'll get big and strong like my child. They'll play together, Simon and David. So she changes breasts. Then he goes into his own thoughts again, thinks of the river again, and this old motor car that was ruined, and the kids got in the car and took turns being the driver and making sounds as though they're driving a real car. The driver made the noises. The rest sat in silence, and the driver goes boop boop grr grr grr. Mistaking Tsotsi's silence for consideration, Miriam spoke on. He needs milk. He needs it more than you think. I'm telling you, this boy David is sick. He may die. What do you know? But I'll take him because yesterday I was jealous about my milk. I was possessive about my milk. And it was wrong. And feeding him makes me happy. Tsotsi wasn't hearing her anymore. She gave him to me. He means that lady under the blue gum trees. Under the tree she gave to him. Of course, she didn't give him to... She did. She thrust the box in his hands, but that's out of perceived threat of what he was going to do to her. Nobody can take him away. He's mine, he's mine. She'd put the baby down on the bed beside her and was standing open. Her blouse hung open. In her excitement, she'd forgotten her modesty. Tsotsi again says, he's mine, but you're not his father. He is mine. There was no arguing with the finality in his voice. Yet for a long time Miriam remained standing at the table, bent slightly forward so as to see Tsotsi clearly. He's mine, he said again. And then she moved, righted her blouse and watched the sleeping babies. Where did you get him? He was given to me. He said, where? Under the trees. And the mother? She ran away in the night. She ran away in the night, he said, making his words as big as he could, shaping them massively with his hands as they came out. She didn't cry for him. She didn't give him no milk. She got him in a box and she gave him to me, and she just ran away in the night. Tell me, she says. I just told you. Tell me more. So he started again from the beginning, telling some things many times until he remembered something else. Miriam listening through it all with a frown and patience, telling without shame how he'd seen her coming through the night with a box and then waited for her, and how he was left holding the baby. He stopped there because what followed was still beyond words and of no interest to her. When did it happen? She asked. He counted back the days. 3 days ago. She shook her head and clicked her tongue softly. So he went on about the milk and feeding it and the ants. She was watching him carefully when he reached the end. His eyes were excited and his hands trembling. So what are you going to do with him? Keep him. Why? He threw back his head and she saw the shine of desperation on his forehead as he struggled with that one mighty word. Why? Why was he? No more revenge. No more hate. The riddle of the yellow bitch was solved. All of this in a few days, and in as short a time, the hold on his life by the blind, black, minute hands, small hands, had grown tighter. Why? Because I must find out, he said. She considered this, but finding her thoughts going around in a circle, she turned to the baby again. She uncovered a medicine bottle of milk in her blanket and put it on the table. Give him this tomorrow, she said, with a spoon. I will come in the afternoon at the same time. Then it was the business again with the blanket and her own baby with a safety pin between her teeth. She straightened, picked up her bucket and went to the door. Tomorrow, he said, tomorrow. And she went out. He gave her time enough to reach her room, and then he picked up the baby and slipped out into the street, and then up to the ruins. But even so, he looked back twice on the way in case she'd hidden somewhere and was following him. After hiding the baby, he set off purposefully in the opposite direction from which he had come. It was a long walk and took him right through the township, reaching his destination towards the middle of the afternoon. Tsotsi found he couldn't control himself. His heart raced and strange sounds broke from his lips as he ran down the footpath to the bottom of the river, the place where those pipes were, where we were with those kids after he'd run away from his father, after the father kicked the dog. So he runs down to the riverside and he sees it again, so he knows it was true. The only change is that more rubbish seemed to have been thrown or blown into the riverbed. He hurried down it. When he found the shell of a motor car, almost as he remembered it, There was no longer any doubt. It was true. It had happened, and to him. He didn't stay a second longer than was necessary, almost running in his hurry to leave the river. Once he got back among the houses and people, he slowed down. It was dark when he reached his street, and he slipped into the first shebeen to ask after the whereabouts of Boston, to find out where is Boston. And perhaps he wants to speak to Boston to make sense of all this and find out what should he do, and why is he holding on to this baby, and to ask Boston's advice now that he's come to terms with his past. 2 chapters to go, and the electrifying final chapter, which I hope will give you a big surprise. I'm really grateful that you've stayed with me. I look forward to seeing you again in chapter 11. Look after yourself until then.